what if a single narrow stretch of water, maybe barely wider than you could swim casually, could just plunge the global economy into chaos? Imagine for a moment you wake up and the world's energy supply, shipping routes, even the price of stuff you buy every day are being held hostage by this tiny passage, just 21 nautical miles wide. Now, this isn't some far-fetched plot from a thriller. It's actually a very real scenario, and it revolves around a name you've probably heard in the news, the Strait of Hormuz. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the Strait of Hormuz. And its true significance, well, it might just surprise you. We've pulled together a strategic report looking at its unparalleled importance, analyzed Iran's potential threats, and looked at the global implications if this vital pathway were ever truly, disrupted. Our mission for you today is to really unpack why this waterway isn't just important, but absolutely critical. What makes it such a geopolitical hotspot, and what would a disruption there truly mean for your daily life and for global energy and trade? Let's unpack this. So to really grasp the gravity of Hormuz, let's start by painting a picture of its geography. Where exactly is it?
Okay, so you'll find it nestled right between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. And what's really striking is just how narrow it gets at its most constricted point, only about 21 nautical miles wide. It's a tiny pinch point for so much global traffic.
21 miles? That really is narrow. And I guess that narrowness is key to its role.
It really is, yeah.
Yes.
That narrowness is precisely what defines its unparalleled role. This isn't just some busy shipping lane. It is the planet's single most critical energy lifeline. Think about this. Based on 2024 estimates, over 17 million barrels of oil flow through Hormuz every single day.
17 million barrels a day.
It's a colossal amount, yeah. And it's primarily coming from major producers like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait. We're looking at roughly 20% of all global oil exports and, maybe even more significantly, 1/3 of all seaborne oil.
1/3 of all oil shipped by sea. That volume alone is just staggering. But it's not only crude oil, is it? There's natural gas, too.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, while oil definitely grabs the headlines, almost all of Qatar's liquefied natural gas, their LNG shipments, also funnel through the strait.
And Qatar is huge in LNG, right? The biggest exporter.
The world's largest LNG exporter. Exactly. So yes, it's not just the world's crude oil supply, it's also absolutely fundamental to global natural gas markets. It truly solidifies its status as the most critical maritime choke point by oil volume, but its importance really extends way beyond just energy.
Okay, so it's clearly an energy artery of epic proportions. But what about broader global trade? Does it handle more than just tankers?
Definitely. Yeah, beyond energy, it's a crucial thoroughfare for all sorts of commercial vessels. Massive crude tankers, sure, but also countless container ships carrying everyday goods. For the Gulf nations, it is the busiest shipping route connecting them to major markets in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. If you were to imagine a kind of global circulatory system for goods, Hormuz is undeniably one of its main valves.
Yeah, I can see that. And when you describe such a critical, narrow passage, it just screams geopolitical hotspot. So what's the surrounding neighborhood like? Who's keeping an eye on this vital choke point?
Well, you've got Iran right there to the north, and then the UAE and Oman to the south. And this region sees a constant, very active presence from the U.S. Fifth Fleet and other NATO navies. They're essentially overseeing and, protecting that critical passage.
Okay.
But on the flip side, Iran actively monitors and asserts a degree of control over shipping. They often do this from military outposts on islands like Qashm, Hormuz, and Abu Musa. So that constant dance, that tension between major naval powers and Iran's asserted control, well, that's what keeps things perpetually on edge there.
Right. And given Iran's position right there bordering the strait, they've certainly tried to leverage that proximity. We've seen them threaten to close it repeatedly, haven't we? What's the strategic thinking there?
Oh, they absolutely have. Iran has this long-standing pattern of threatening closure, often as a direct response when Western sanctions tighten, or if they perceive military threats. It's a strategic card they play to remind the world of their leverage. It's a powerful deterrent in a standoff situation,
Makes sense. And if they were, hypothetically, to act on those threats, what kind of tactical arsenal could they actually deploy? What tools do they have?
Well, their primary tools would come from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN.
Okay, the IRGC Navy.
Right. And this includes things like fast attack craft, small, quick boats, naval mines, and anti-ship missiles launched from the coast or ships. They're also quite adept at what's called asymmetric naval warfare tactics.
Yeah.
Think swarm boats, like lots of small boats overwhelming a larger target, drones, and again, using mines to sort of disrupt or surprise a more technologically advanced force.
So unconventional methods.
Exactly. It's about leveraging those unconventional methods to counter superior conventional power.
That brings up an interesting legal point, doesn't it? Iran often cites security rights in its territorial waters. But how does that square with established international maritime law for such a vital global passage?
Yeah, that's precisely where the ambiguity lies, and it's a huge point of contention. While Iran asserts these security rights, international maritime law, specifically the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, it explicitly states that a vital international passage like Hormuz cannot be closed to international shipping.
So it would illegal under international law.
Any actual attempt at closure would be a clear violation of international law, yes.
And it's not just direct Iranian military action we need to consider, is it? What about the potential for, like, proxy escalation using other groups?
Indeed, that's a really important dimension. Iran has a network of proxies in the region. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen, they could potentially be mobilized. They might target shipping or oil infrastructure even beyond the strait itself. This could create broader regional instability and sort of extend Iran's strategic reach without them needing a direct conventional fight.
Right, widening the conflict zone.
Exactly. That's a less obvious, but maybe equally concerning kind of ripple effect.
Okay, so let's get into the heart of it. What would actually happen if the Strait of Hormuz were to close, even temporarily? The sources we looked at paint a picture of truly catastrophic global economic shockwaves. Can you sort of walk us through that initial immediate impact?
Yeah, the first and probably most dramatic impact would be on oil prices. We're talking about an estimated surge, maybe 30 to 50% or potentially even more practically overnight.
Wow, 30–50%.
And this isn't just about what you pay at the pump, though that would certainly hit your wallet hard. It would send massive shockwaves through global energy supply chains. Economies in Asia, think China, Japan, India, which are incredibly dependent on Gulf oil, they'd be particularly devastated.
Right.
And you have to think about how that cascades into manufacturing, transportation, literally every economic sector.
And it wouldn't just be the cost of oil itself, right? What happens to general shipping costs for everything else moving through there and needing to go around?
Absolutely. Tanker insurance premiums would skyrocket.
Yeah.
Shipping rates for all commercial vessels, container ships included, would just go through the roof. This isn't just an inconvenience, it immediately makes everything more expensive, from imported electronics to food to raw materials. It would lead to widespread inflation globally.
So a direct hit to consumers and businesses.
A direct hit, yes,
Yeah.
to consumer pockets and business margins alike.
Beyond the immediate financial pain, there's this specter of a severe energy security crisis. How would the world even begin to cope if that much oil and gas suddenly stopped flowing?
Well, strategic reserves, like the ones held by the US, the EU, China, they could offer a temporary buffer, maybe for a few weeks, perhaps a couple of months.
A temporary buffer, okay.
But the long-term impact would still be severe. While there are some alternative routes, you mentioned pipelines earlier, like Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, Petroline, and the UAE's Fujairah pipeline.
Right.
They simply don't have the full capacity to replace all the Gulf exports that normally go through Hormuz. They could buy crucial time, maybe mitigate the initial shock, but they can't solve the underlying problem. The tangible threat here is a severe recession, especially for European and Asian economies, driven by prohibitively high energy costs that they just couldn't sustain for long.
This sounds like a recipe for direct military escalation. Is that almost a certainty in this scenario?
Yes, unfortunately, it probably is. The principle of freedom of navigation is paramount for global trade, and the U.S. and its allies are unequivocally committed to upholding it. So a closure attempt would almost certainly trigger a U.S. and coalition naval intervention.
And that carries huge risks.
It carries a very high risk of a direct military clash with Iranian forces, which could then very quickly escalate into a broader regional war involving other major players like Israel and Saudi Arabia and their respective proxies as well.
And that kind of regional conflict could easily spill over beyond just the strait itself, maybe hitting critical infrastructure on land.
Precisely. There's a heightened risk of missile attacks targeting critical Gulf infrastructure. Think Saudi Aramco oil processing facilities or major UAE ports like Jebel Ali. Any attack on those kinds of facilities would not only disrupt energy supplies further, but it would fundamentally destabilize the entire region.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, the impact on broader global trade would just be immense. It really isn't just about energy, is it?
Without a doubt, no. Imagine insurance costs for all commercial shipping soaring to levels we've never seen before. Global supply chains, especially for container shipping carrying all your consumer goods, they'd be forced to reroute. This means significant delays and driving widespread inflation across pretty much every industry.
So the ultimate risk is
The ultimate risk is global stagflation, that really toxic combination of high inflation and stagnant economic growth if these energy and shipping disruptions persist for any significant length of time. It's a nightmare scenario, economically speaking.
okay, so knowing all that potential fallout, let's talk practicalities. How would Western powers actually respond? It's important, I think, to clarify Iran's actual ability to close the strait. You mentioned they can disrupt shipping, but is a long-term total closure militarily sustainable for them?
That's a really critical point to understand, yeah. Realistically, Iran can disrupt shipping. They could cause significant problems for days, maybe even a few weeks, using those tools we talked about, mines, speedboats, missiles, drones. But completely sealing off the strait for a prolonged period, say, beyond 1 or 2 weeks, is probably militarily unsustainable for them.
Why is that? What makes it unsustainable for Iran in the longer run?
Well, a few key reasons. First, they would face overwhelming retaliation from the U.S. and allied navies. Their naval assets, while numerous, especially the small boats, would likely be rapidly depleted when facing superior technology and firepower from forces like the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which has carriers, destroyers, submarines right there.
Okay, so militarily outmatched eventually.
Eventually,
Okay.
yes. Second, Iran's own oil terminals and its broader economy are extremely vulnerable to counterstrikes. And critically, their economy itself relies heavily on the strait for its own exports, mainly oil. So any sustained closure would effectively be hurting Iran, perhaps more than anyone else, in the long run. It's like sawing off the branch they're sitting on.
Right, self-defeating in a way.
Yeah.
So, given those limitations on Iran's side, what would the immediate military response from Western powers look like? You said swift.
It would be incredibly swift and robust. You'd see the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which is based right there in Bahrain, working alongside UK, French, possibly Saudi forces, immediately launching a multinational naval operation.
And what would that involve specifically?
Well, rapid mine-clearing operations using specialized naval assets, minesweepers, helicopters, underwater drones. You'd see air superiority missions to quickly neutralize any Iranian coastal missile systems threatening ships. Definitely carrier strike group deployments to enforce the shipping lanes and provide air cover. And you could also expect sophisticated cyber operations aimed at disabling Iranian naval command and control systems, basically trying to blind their ability to coordinate attacks.
Wow, okay. A very comprehensive multi-domain response. It sounds like a massive coordinated effort. Is there historical precedent for this kind of coalition building in the Gulf? Did this happen before?
There is actually a very relevant one. During the Iran-Iraq War back in the 1980s, the so-called tanker war phase, the U.S. launched Operation Earnest Will.
Ernest Will, okay.
Yeah, and under that operation, they reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers with the U.S. flag and then escorted them through Hormuz to protect them from attack. You'd likely see a very similar multinational effort today, maybe involving NATO members, plus key Arab Gulf allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They'd form up to escort tankers and strictly enforce freedom of navigation under international maritime law. It's a proven model.
Got it. And what if Iran were to, say, directly attack ships or actually succeed in mining the strait before it could be fully secured? Would there be preemptive or retaliatory strikes from the coalition then?
Yes, that's highly likely. If Iran attacks ships or lays mines, you could expect swift precision strikes targeting the assets involved, so IRGC bases, missile launchers, naval ports where the attack craft operate from. There would also likely be a potential counter-blockade of Iranian oil exports, further squeezing their economy as retaliation. The response would be multifaceted and designed to quickly degrade their ability to interfere and restore freedom of navigation.
Beyond direct military action, what diplomatic and economic tools would be brought to bear? It wouldn't just be guns and ships, right? There'd be other pressures.
Not at all, no. You'd see immediate emergency sessions at the UN Security Council, probably resulting in resolutions condemning the action. You'd also see a rapid expansion and tightening of existing economic sanctions targeting Iran's banking sector, its energy sector, its shipping sector, And crucially, severe economic retaliation through secondary sanctions.
Secondary sanctions meaning targeting other countries dealing with Iran.
Exactly. Putting pressure on any countries or companies worldwide that might be perceived as aiding Iran or trying to circumvent the primary sanctions, the economic pressure would be immense and almost instantaneous.
We mentioned those alternative routes earlier, the pipelines like Petroline and the UAE one. How much relief could those really offer during such a crisis? Are they a genuine fallback?
They are important, definitely. Pipelines like Saudi Arabia's Petroline, which has about a 5 million barrels per day capacity running to the Red Sea, and the UAE's Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, they would indeed offer some temporary relief.
Some relief.
Some, yes. They are absolutely crucial for buying time and maybe mitigating the worst of the initial price shock. But, and this is the key thing, they simply aren't enough to replace all the Gulf exports that typically pass through Hormuz. Not even close, really. So they can't fully solve the problem. They can only sort of defer the full impact for a bit.
Okay, so if Iran can't realistically close it long term and the response would be massive, what's the real danger here for you, for global markets? What's the main takeaway from all this potential response?
Yeah, that's the crucial question. The greatest threat isn't actually a sustained long-term blockade that totally seals off the strait for months on end. That's probably unlikely, as we discussed. Instead, the critical danger lies in a short-term, but incredibly sharp spike in oil prices, the resulting widespread market panic, and most gravely, the potential for a rapid, uncontrolled regional war escalation.
Right, the unpredictability.
Exactly. It's the unpredictability and the cascading effects of even a short-lived conflict in that specific location that could send truly devastating ripples across the world economy and, international relations.
This whole situation naturally leads us to think about proactive strategies and long-term contingency planning.
Yeah.
What are the major forces at play trying to mitigate this vulnerability? What's being done?
Well, one major focus is certainly ongoing military deterrence. There's a continuous effort by a U.S.-led coalition, sometimes formalized, sometimes less so, potentially forming a multinational naval task force if needed, sort of echoing those 1980s tanker war efforts. You'd also see NATO allies and GCC forces constantly deploying assets and conducting exercises specifically designed to counter Iranian threats like mines, drones, and those fast attack boats. It's a constant show of force and readiness intended to prevent miscalculation.
Makes sense. And then there's the broader, more global strategy of energy diversification. How is that playing out in response to this kind of risk?
Exactly. This geopolitical vulnerability, this choke point risk, it absolutely accelerates the global push to increase oil and gas output from other regions. Think North America, Brazil, maybe parts of Africa, anywhere but the Gulf, essentially, to lessen that dependence.
Right.
There's also significant increased investment in non-Gulf LNG projects, for instance, in Australia, the U.S., the East Mediterranean, trying to find alternative gas sources. And, for Western and major Asian economies, this entire situation fundamentally renews the urgency for a much faster transition towards green energy sources, towards renewables, to reduce that fundamental reliance on fossil fuels shipped through risky areas.
So it pushes the green transition too. What about on the diplomatic front? What ongoing channels are critical here to manage these tensions before they boil over?
Diplomacy is key, absolutely. Backdoor diplomacy, often through countries that have channels to both sides, like, say, Oman or Qatar, maybe even China playing a role now. That remains incredibly important for de-escalating tensions quietly behind the scenes.
Keeping lines open.
Keeping lines open, managing misperceptions. You'd also, of course, see emergency UN Security Council sessions used to apply public diplomatic pressure on Iran if a crisis were to actually unfold.
And what about the specific legal and maritime measures that would come into play to sort of reestablish normal operations if there was a disruption?
Well, internationally, efforts would quickly focus on using the mechanisms within UN maritime law, UNCLSS, to legally justify actions to reestablish freedom of passage. Additionally, on a practical level, you'd see coordination on temporary rerouting for commercial shipping where possible, and maybe the establishment of insurance pooling mechanisms for global fleets to manage the immediate economic impact of risk and keep essential goods moving, even at higher cost.
Okay. If we connect all of this to the really big picture, looking long term, what are the profound geopolitical implications of having this constant major vulnerability at the heart of the global energy system?
Well, it undeniably means an accelerated global push away from Gulf dependency for energy security. That's probably the biggest strategic shift. You'd also likely see, unfortunately, an increased arms race and further militarization of Gulf waters as both sides try to bolster their capabilities.
More tension, potentially.
Potentially more tension, yes, or at least higher stakes. Countries like India, China, Russia, they could take on even greater strategic roles as power brokers in Gulf dynamics, given their own significant energy needs and influence. And for Iran itself, unless de-escalation is successfully pursued diplomatically over the long term, this continued friction could lead to even deeper global isolation and economic strain for them.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems crystal clear that the Strait of Hormuz remains, well, the single most critical point of vulnerability in the entire global energy and trade system. It's a true pinch point for world commerce.
Absolutely. And while Iran's threats may often, perhaps largely, serve as a form of deterrence and political leverage rather than a statement of imminent action, any serious attempt at closure, even a partial or temporary one, would still send immediate and severe economic and military ripples across the entire world.
It really forces a pivotal question for all of us, doesn't it? How might our continued reliance on such a vulnerable choke point shape future global power dynamics? And maybe more importantly, what proactive steps, beyond those we've discussed, might the world actually need to take to truly insulate itself from this ongoing and probably persistent geopolitical flashpoint? Something to think about.